It's one of the great paradoxes of American rock and roll. Creedence Clearwater Revival. Four working-class boys from California, who sounded like they crawled out of a Louisiana swamp, climbed to the top of the charts in the late 1960s, pumping out hit after hit with the force of a freight train. But just as the new decade dawned and CCR stood on the verge of legendary longevity, it all began to fall apart. They weren't destroyed by drugs, they didn't disappear in a plane crash, and they never burned out from lack of talent. Instead, Creedence Clearwater Revival self-destructed. Their music was timeless. But the band? It couldn't even last a decade. What really happened behind the scenes of CCR's meteoric rise and equally abrupt fall? Let's wind it back to the beginning. To the swamp rock kings who never made it past the 60s. In 1959, three high school friends from El Cerrito, California, John Fogerty, Doug Clifford, and Stu Cook, started a band called the Blue Velvets. They were suburban kids obsessed with R&B, instrumental rock, and the soulful grit of Southern blues. By 1964, they had added John's older brother Tom Fogerty to the mix and rebranded as the Gollywogs under Fantasy Records, a small label run by Saul Zaentz. The Gollywogs wore Beatle-esque wigs and tried chasing trends, but the music lacked identity. It wasn't until they renamed themselves Creedence Clearwater Revival in 1967, combining Creedence, a friend's name, Clearwater, a reference to a beer commercial, and Revival, their own musical rebirth, that the sound we now recognize was born. But here's the twist. While they sounded like swampy Southerners, not one of them had ever even been to Mississippi. The bayou was a myth, an aesthetic, a sound John Fogerty built from records, rhythm, and imagination. From 1968 to 1970, CCR was a hit machine. Proud Mary, Bad Moon Rising, Fortunate Son, Down on the Corner, and Green River were released back-to-back, and all stormed up the charts. Their albums, Bayou Country, Green River, Willie and the Poor Boys, Cosmo's Factory, all arrived within the span of just 2 years. John Fogerty wasn't just writing songs. He was crafting anthems for a broken generation. His lyrics, drenched in working-class rage and blue-collar imagery, resonated in a country torn apart by Vietnam, civil rights protests, and political chaos. Fortunate Son wasn't subtle, it was a gut punch to privileged America, but while their sound was exploding across airwaves, something much darker was simmering underneath. John Fogerty wrote every song. He produced the records, he played many of the instruments. In many ways he was CCR. And that created tensions no chart success could keep buried forever. Behind CCR's tightly constructed sound was something far more rigid, John Fogerty's iron grip on control. Bandmates Stu Cook and Doug Clifford have described the recording sessions as a dictatorship. John wrote the songs, arranged them, produced them, and often told the others exactly what and how to play. This wasn't a four-man democracy, it was a one-man operation with a backing band. At first, it worked. The hits kept coming, and the public didn't know or care about the tension. But internally, the resentment was building. Tom Fogerty, John's older brother and rhythm guitarist, began to feel particularly sidelined. He wanted to contribute songs. He wanted a voice. But John shut it down. John later admitted in interviews that he felt a burden to carry the band. "If I allowed them input," he said, "we would have broken up 2 years earlier." Tom disagreed, and eventually he left. In early 1971, as CCR stood at the height of their fame, Tom Fogerty walked out. He was done playing second fiddle to his younger brother, and the band didn't stop him. It was the first public crack in the facade, and the beginning of the end. In the wake of Tom's departure, John made a fateful decision. Cook and Clifford, fed up with being sidelined, demanded more involvement. And in what looked like an act of democratic reform, but felt more like sabotage, John agreed. For the next album, Mardi Gras, 1972, everyone would contribute songs equally. It was a disaster. Doug Clifford and Stu Cook were competent musicians, but they weren't songwriters, not on Fogerty's level. Their contributions were mediocre at best, and John's own tracks sounded deliberately uninspired. Critics savaged Mardi Gras. Rolling Stone called it the worst album ever made by a major rock band. It was the sound of a group falling apart in real time. But it wasn't just about quality. It was about intent. Many, including Cook and Clifford themselves, believed John set them up to fail, giving them the control they wanted, but ensuring it would tank. The album still sold respectably, thanks to CCR's name. But it ended the band. In October 1972, Creedence Clearwater Revival officially disbanded. Just 5 years after their debut, the dream was over. After CCR's breakup, John Fogerty walked into yet another battle, this time not with his band, but with the very label that helped make him a star, Fantasy Records. In a move that shocked many, John sold his publishing rights to Fantasy founder Saul Zaentz in exchange for releasing the band from their contract. It was a desperate deal, and one John would regret for decades. Without owning his songs, John watched helplessly as Zaentz licensed them for commercials, movies, and reissues, often in ways John found disrespectful to the band's legacy. Worse, John refused to play CCR songs live for years, unwilling to enrich the man he believed had robbed him. His bitterness ran deep. He referred to Zaentz in interviews as the devil, and even wrote thinly veiled diss tracks like Zons Can't Dance, which had to be retitled after a lawsuit. Incredibly, Zaentz later sued Fogerty for allegedly plagiarizing himself. The claim? That John's solo song The Old Man Down the Road sounded too much like CCR's Run Through the Jungle, both of which John himself had written. Fogerty eventually won, but not before spending hundreds of thousands in legal fees. The trial left emotional scars. As he told one interviewer years later, "I felt like a prisoner of my own songs." If John's battles with Saul Zaentz were bitter, his feud with his own brother was tragic. Tom Fogerty had gone on to a modest solo career after leaving CCR, releasing a string of albums to little fanfare. But he remained estranged from John for the rest of his life. The brothers tried to reconnect in the late 80s, but it didn't take. Their last meeting was brief and tense. Not long after, Tom was diagnosed with AIDS, contracted through a blood transfusion. He died in 1990. At his funeral, John didn't play a song. He didn't speak. He left quickly after the service. Later, John expressed regret that they never reconciled, but by then, it was too late. In his autobiography, John wrote, "I was sad that life had gone by, and we hadn't been able to find peace. And I realized I didn't even know who my brother was anymore." This family fracture wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. The brotherly bond that had once been the emotional core of CCR had ended in silence and legal bitterness. And it would cast a long shadow over the band's legacy. In 1993, Creedence Clearwater Revival was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It should have been a celebration, a moment to honor one of the most successful bands of the late 60s. But instead, it became another symbol of everything that had gone wrong. All three surviving members, John Fogerty, Stu Cook, and Doug Clifford, were invited to attend. But behind the scenes, things were tense. Cook and Clifford wanted to perform. John refused. Why? Because the Hall of Fame wanted to pair the three of them together on stage for a CCR reunion. John, still furious about past lawsuits and betrayals, flatly refused to play with his former bandmates. He would only perform with Bruce Springsteen and Robbie Robertson. So during the ceremony, the audience watched in awkward silence as John took the stage, thanked his musical influences, and pointedly left out his brother Tom and his former bandmates. Stu and Doug sat quietly, humiliated. They later described it as one of the most disrespectful moments of their careers. The Hall of Fame had tried to stitch a broken band back together for one night, but the wounds were too deep. This wasn't a reunion. It was a funeral for what could have been. By the mid-90s, Stu Cook and Doug Clifford were ready to revive the music of Creedence without John. They formed a touring band called Creedence Clearwater Revisited, playing all the old hits with a new singer. And to fans starved for that swamp rock sound, it was a hit. The group toured for over 2 decades, often packing amphitheaters and festivals. But John saw red. He filed a lawsuit, claiming the name was too close to the original band and could confuse fans. The courts disagreed. Cook and Clifford were allowed to use the name, and the bitterness only deepened. Ironically, while Cook and Clifford were out playing Bad Moon Rising and Fortunate Son to sold-out crowds, John was still refusing to perform those very songs in his solo shows. For a long time, it felt like Creedence existed in 2 ghostly versions, one playing the songs without the voice, and the other with the voice but none of the band. Even fans were divided. Some accused Cook and Clifford of cashing in. Others blamed John for being too proud. But at the core, it all pointed back to the same unhealed wound. A band that had burned so hot, so fast, and so painfully that not even nostalgia could bring them back together. Creedence Clearwater Revival officially disbanded in 1972, But in truth, they never broke up. They shattered. What remains today is not just a catalog of timeless hits, but a story soaked in regret. John Fogerty eventually reclaimed his right to perform CCR's music. After a decades-long feud with Fantasy Records and Saul Zaentz, he began playing, quote, Proud Mary and Have You Ever Seen the Rain again in concert. But by then, the original band was long gone. Tom Fogerty passed away in 1990, still estranged from his brother. Doug and Stu continued with Revisited until 2019. John went on to become a celebrated solo artist, finally inducted on his own terms into rock royalty. But there was never a reunion, never a healing moment, just silence. And yet despite the wreckage, Creedence Clearwater Revival's influence never dimmed. Their stripped-down, working-class ethos music, without makeup still, speaks to those who lived through the 60s and to those discovering it anew. They weren't psychedelic. They weren't glam. They weren't polished. They were real. And maybe that's why they couldn't last. Because in a world of image and illusion, Creedence was too honest to survive. So why didn't Creedence Clearwater Revival make it past the 60s? Because success came too fast. Because power wasn't shared. Because art collided with ego, family with business, and idealism with industry. It's easy to romanticize bands like Creedence, to remember only the soundtrack they gave us. But when we look closer, we see the price of greatness. Friendships lost, brothers divided, and the kind of pain that platinum records can't fix. Still, that voice, John's growl, that guitar, that groove, it never went away. And in that way, CCR never really left. They may have burned out, but they burned brighter than almost anyone. This is Southern Sound, and we tell the stories behind the music that shaped generations. If you felt this one, stick with us, because we've got more legends, more heartbreak, and more rock and amp. Roll truths coming your way. Thanks for watching.